Thank you for joining us as we look at the Pride Divide, an exclusive conversation only on ABC 57 News. I'm Tim Spears. Tonight, we're diving headfirst into a topic that's become increasingly divisive across the country and here in Michiana, LGBTQ acceptance. So why are we talking about it now? Because nobody else is. In recent years, Indiana has passed a series of laws directly impacting the Pride community. And here in Michiana, the debate has played out over protests and rhetoric, seemingly separate from the people that these issues impact. Over the next hour, ABC 57 is exploring the conversation around education, mental health, and yes, gender transition, all with our series of panelists who we'll introduce in a moment. On your screen, we have a list of Republican lawmakers we contacted to join this panel. They all declined to participate or did not respond. First, here's ABC 57's Brian Conybeare.
Tim, we recently met one Michiana family who decided they had to pick up and move out of the state of Indiana because of a new law. Senate Bill 480 bans all gender-affirming care for minors under the age of 18.
This is my son before he transitioned.
This Hoosier mom, who we'll call Jane, agreed to sit down with ABC 57 News, but only anonymously, for fear of outing her transgender son, who's 16 years old.
You're born who you are. So my kids were born in the wrong bodies.
She also has a trans daughter in her 20s, and the family decided last year they simply had to leave Indiana. You chose to move your family from one state to another. Why?
We moved to Michigan because Michigan is a state that's much more affirming.
Senate Bill 480 was approved in 2023 and after a legal battle just took effect in March, banning doctors from helping minors go through sex change treatments, exactly what Jane's teenage son is doing.
They can't get their testosterone or their estrogen or their puberty blockers or any of those things anymore. In fact, the doctors can't even recommend other doctors for the children to go see. So we had to, find those medical professionals on our own.
Out of state.
Out of state. We can't even get my son's prescriptions filled in Indiana.
As originally drafted, that law would have also allowed the state to remove trans children from their homes if their parents violated it. While that provision was deleted by lawmakers just before the bill passed, it was frightening enough to force Jane and her husband to take action.
I needed to protect my child, needed to protect my family from having our child removed from us. So we immediately started looking for to move out of state. That was the home where our kids grew up. And so now we've had to, abandon that home, that life that we had to be able to protect our family.
Because of a law passed in Indiana.
Because of a law passed in Indiana.
Jane shared these family photos over the years and says there were early signs two of her kids were not comfortable with their sex assigned at birth, starting with their oldest.
When she was about maybe 11 years old or so, she came to us and said, Mom, Dad, I think I'm a girl. And we told her, no, she wasn't. That was just, middle school is hard. You're experiencing hard things and weird feelings and things like that. And so we didn't think about it again until about 4 years ago when our then 12-year-old son came to us and said, Mom, Dad, I know I was born a girl, but I'm pretty sure I'm a boy. And so we became, quickly very supportive and very encouraging.
But for the first one, you weren't quite as accepting
Correct.
Right away.
Yeah, not at all. And part of that is just, that was 15, 16 years ago. So I don't feel like we understood what was happening. As parents, we had no choice but to accept what our kids came to us and told us, that they were trans. Because we would rather have a trans child than be bearing a dead child.
You were concerned about suicide.
Absolutely.
What would you say to a family that said, I can't live in Indiana anymore, it's not good for my trans child, I'm moving to Michigan or Illinois?
Well, I would say, first of all, my heart goes out to you, and my heart goes out to your child, because your child is obviously gender confused. And first of all, they need help understanding that they can never be the opposite sex. And wherever you go, you are not only harming your own child, essentially, but you are harming any other child you're putting them in the same facility with, because you don't know what's going to happen.
Rhonda Miller is the head of Purple for Parents Indiana, an activist group based in Napanee.
We fight to protect children against the indoctrination and the sexual perversion in the schools.
Miller lobbies for anti-LGBTQ laws at the State House and has a very active presence online, trying to prevent the normalization of transsexuals in schools.
We don't see those kids as dangerous. We see those kids as victims, really, when it comes down to it, because they've been caught up in this whole gender ideology and the gender confusion that's taking place in our society. And parents are scared. They're getting caught up in being told that if you don't transition your child's going to commit suicide.
Miller says she even pulled her own son out of public school because of her concerns.
You have some of these sex ed programs that are supposed to be abstinence-based because we are an abstinent state, but it says they have to touch on abstinence. It's not required abstinence only. And so they're grooming children for all kinds of sex acts. You have to remove all sex ed programs from the schools, because the schools should be teaching academics. Leave sex education up to the parents. That's where I would start.
When it comes to trans students using different pronouns and school facilities with other kids,
Who's going to protect the girls in the locker room, in the bathrooms, when there's a boy in there who might have ulterior motives? The schools were trained that they had to open up their locker rooms, their bathrooms, and their overnight trips. They had to change the pronouns. If the children decided they wanted to be called something else because they had been encouraged and advocated for, they had to use the pronoun usage, and they didn't have to tell the parents.
What they're saying really is, I don't want to show that I value or respect you as a person, so I'm not going to use your chosen pronouns.
And for Jane, she says her 2 children are much happier now after transitioning to the opposite sex, and hopes everyone can become more accepting of people who happen to be different.
It's sad that people can't just leave trans kids alone. People are always scared of what they don't know. But meeting families and seeing that we're all just normal people trying to have our lives and not have our lives disrupted and uprooted so that our child can feel safe and loved.
And we're now joined by our group of panelists, H.R. Jung with the LGBTQ Center here in South Bend, Chris Daly with the ACLU, Zoe O'Haley Byrne of Indiana Youth Group, and Nathaniel Clausen, the parent of a transgender child. Thank you all for joining us. First off, did anyone have any first reactions to that piece?
So many. I think one of the big things that people conflate so often, and I saw it happening with the lady from Purple for Parents, is there is a difference between sex and gender. By definition, both medically and linguistically, and gender is something that is a societal construct, and I think that's something that so many people need to know from the jump when we have this conversation. Gender and sex are not the same thing, and they never have been.
After that, Nathaniel, you have a transgender child. Mm-hmm. Have you ever considered moving out of the state like this family did?
We have considered moving out of the state, but we are part of the lawsuit over SB 480, and if we leave, we don't get to be part of that lawsuit. And it's very important to my family to stand up for all of the families who can't.
Families who also didn't even feel comfortable showing their face. And I want to ask you, HR, we'll get to the legislation that they mentioned in a moment, but how would you describe just the overall environment for the Pride community in Indiana?
There's a lot of fear. They just don't know what's next on the chopping block, if you will, of personal rights and liberties of LGBTQ people here in the state of Indiana. Right now there's a lot of legislation around transgender individuals, but when that's finished, where are they going next? And I think that's where a lot of LGBTQ people in the state of Indiana are feeling that kind of pressure and unsure about how safe they're going to be living in their own home state.
And Zoe, what would you say is the source of that pressure? Is it the personal interactions with everyday Hoosiers, or is it more of the politics and just having to sort through that coming through the news in the State House?
Not their personal interactions at all, but like what these conversations that are happening supposedly over their head. They hear adults talking about them, these queer youth, and it's people having these conversations behind closed doors where they're not even invited to say their part, or in some ways their parents aren't even able to be part of those conversations. So I think it's this higher up coming down that's so scary to them. Like in their everyday life, they may meet people who are affirming and loving and caring, and then they hear that their state is trying to harm them, and that has to wreak such havoc on them emotionally that these people they don't even know want to harm them in that way.
And this isn't a fear that just the LGBT community is facing in Indiana, although it's very prevalent for our community, but women have been denied their access to reproductive freedom. Communities of color have been told that civil rights are not going to be taught in schools. This is an issue that we're seeing bubble up statewide in all of our communities. And I think that, as Zoe said, personal interactions have improved so much in this state. The neighbor to neighbor, coworker to coworker contact is vastly different than it was 10, 20 years ago. What has happened, though, is this pushback from our state house, really in response to nothing.
On that note, we'll talk about some specific legislation next and how we're introducing these topics to our youngest Hoosiers.